September 11th started out that day like any other day. I worked at the Frederick County Emergency Communications Center. I was on duty, and we usually have the morning news on, and we were watching it, and all of a sudden, boom, that first plane hit, and it's like, uh-oh. And then the second one hit, and everybody knew then that life was about to change. Things got real busy, and I came home. I received a telephone call from the communications center, and they said, we've got a call from the command post at the Pentagon, and they wanted to know if you would take your ladder truck down to the Pentagon. And I said, well, if they need us and our country needs us, we'll be on the way. What they needed us for was to fit inside the Pentagon, because the entrance ceilings were only 10 feet tall, and none of the modern equipment would fit in there. And ironically, our doors here are 10 feet. So we've never bought anything over 10 feet, so I knew that we would fit. When we got down there, it was dark. And as we approached I'm expecting to see a lot of stuff. They had the part where the plane went in was all lit up with lights, and you could see that. We got an escort to bring us in. I forget where exactly they picked us up, but they escorted us in. They had an inside the Pentagon command post, and the commander walked up, and I'll never forget this the rest of my life. Here we were, a bunch of, this older truck, country boys, long way from home, from the fire department, and he walked up to this tall, lanky captain walked up to me and said, "Chief, how can I help you help us?" I will take that phrase to my grave, because it was the greatest introduction that I've ever heard. And I walked over to command post, and what had happened, where the plane hit, naturally there was fire. And they had been attacking it all day, but as darkness set in, there was pockets of jet fuel all over the place. And every now and then you hear explosions. And they decided it was too unsafe to try to put the fire out tonight, to stop it and not let it go any further into the Pentagon, and then we'll battle it in the morning. We were the last line of defense. We were at the section where the fire had burned up to, and our job was to keep that drowned with water. Command post had asked us, can you get any deeper into the Pentagon? And I said, I'll find out. And actually there was a guy on a golf cart who was a maintenance guy, and I said, if anybody knows this place, he does. I said, will you give me a ride down to where the most damage was? They want us to go down in there. So he said, yes, sir. And he took me down in there, and it was too unsafe to go down inside it. I looked down the one hallway, and I said, what is that? It just looked like, I didn't know what it was. It was weird. And I walked up to it, and I stood there, and I looked at it, and then I noticed a tire. And then I started noticing the color of the tin pile. And then I noticed body parts. And I looked over at the wall where the plane had come in to the Pentagon. I looked, and there was this big circle, hole. And I lined it up there, and I looked, and I said, I realized this was the cockpit. September 12th on the morning, it was a beautiful morning, sun was shining, and I looked up at the end of the ladder truck, and a rainbow had formed across the Pentagon from our water, and I just looked back at the guys, and I just looked, and I said, I knew we was gonna be all right. I heard a person say that maybe today our flag, we hung a little lower because of the tragedy. And I told the person, I don't think our flag ever stood any taller.
Well, at the time that September 11th events occurred, I was working for the City of Fairfax Fire Department in Northern Virginia. as the Assistant Fire Chief of Operations. I was in my office that morning and received a call from the shift captain that was on duty at our Fire Station 3, indicating to me that the events were unfolding at the World Trade Center in New York City. I turned the television on and began to watch those events, and then I think, as everyone knows, a short time later the Pentagon was impacted by an aircraft. Our headquarters office was only about 12 miles away from the Pentagon, and I actually felt the impact in my third floor office at our headquarters fire station. Didn't really understand what was taking place until the news footage cut in indicating that a plane had gone into the Pentagon. The city fire chief happened to be out of the area at the time, and so my first duties were to begin callback of off-duty personnel to upstaff the city fire department, because it was very clear that this was going to be a major and long-term incident that was going to require a lot of resources. So I spent about the first hour and a half after the Pentagon was struck, gearing the city of Fairfax resources up so that we could contribute as well as keep our city services in place for our own community at the same time. I then left as greater alarms were sounded. I arrived at the Pentagon just before 10 o'clock in the morning, so the Pentagon incident had been unfolding for better than an hour before I arrived. Heavy fire conditions on multiple floors made it very difficult for the firefighting forces to operate to conduct search and rescue, and that's primarily because the Pentagon, in terms of the way it's constructed, is a fortress. My particular role, as the afternoon continued, I was assigned to be the division commander of what was known as the A&E division. So I was operating at a command post in the inner courtyard, responsible for the crews that were working inside in rings A through E. So a call went out after I made the request to the surrounding jurisdictions looking for a very low-profile ladder truck, and the answer came from the Woodsboro Volunteer Fire Company here in Frederick, Maryland. They responded, they showed up, came through the service tunnel without any problem, and I met with them initially, gave them their tactical position to set up, and that's where I first met Chief Mickey Fyock. And of course I didn't know that at that point our paths would cross again in my employment here, but I will tell you that the crew from Woodsboro and their truck set up, they performed flawlessly, they operated through the entire overnight hours to carry out their mission. I guess in terms of what the Pentagon, interestingly enough, helped the fire departments prove is that all of the regional coordination and joint training that we had done in the years prior really paid off. But to see this in one event that essentially combined a building fire, a crash of a commercial airliner, and the collapse of a very large structure all into one incident is almost unheard of, and yet it was unfolding before our eyes. I think the message is that we're a nation that can take a punch. Nothing after that put a dent in our resilience as a country, as Americans, as what we stand for when it comes to how our society acts and behaves together as the greater community of the United States of America.
I was here. I was getting dressed. I was headed to the hospital. I was president of the hospital auxiliary, and I was going for a photo shoot with the advertisers. And I got a telephone call, and it was Alan. And Alan said, "Mom, I wanted to let you know I'm all right." And I said to him, "Why wouldn't you be all right?" And he said, "Haven't you heard? An airplane's hit the World Trade Center." He said, "Turn on the TV." Well, the TV's always on in this house, but the news hadn't started to cover it. But while we were talking, the news started to cover it. He went through a series of questions trying to validate whether it was his building or not his building. And I affirmed him at the time it wasn't his building. And so I verified, and he said, "I think it's a small plane." And I said, "I don't think so, Alan." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because that hole goes from one side of the building to the other."
And then Sharon called me at work. I was working for BB&T at the time. I was regional president here in Frederick, and I had an appointment. I had a 9 o'clock appointment, but I also had a TV in my office. So she called I didn't have the TV on, so I turned it on, and I was talking with my administrative assistant as well as my client that was coming in, and I was telling him, you know, my son, just, you know, about the world that the plane had hit the one tower, and of course the other, I mean, they're showing pictures, and I said, well, yeah, my son's in that tower right there. And then just about that time is when that second plane came in, which was just crazy to watch that happen live. And once that happened, I immediately basically told them I couldn't stay there anymore, came home, and you know, we were watching what was going on TV. Then here, when that South Tower fell down, I just couldn't believe that, because until then I felt reasonably confident that Alan could get out, although his office was on the 104th floor of the South Tower, so he's way up at the top. After that building fell, which was less than about a half an hour after it got hit, that just seemed like it was very difficult for them to have gotten out in that, you know, in that amount of time. But we didn't, you know, of course, we didn't know anything. We had family members. Of course, you know, everybody's trying to contact somebody on the telephone or whatever. Of course, all the lines, by that time, everything was down up there. Everything was jammed up. We had, I think, 4 family members that actually drove up to New York and, you know, kind of went to apparently the hospitals had posted names of people on their outside, on the outside of the buildings. Others of us stayed here and kind of manned the phones and the, you know, whatever computers we had and so forth to see, you know, hope that there was some communication someplace. We went and tried to check through homeless shelters and those kind of places to see, well, maybe he got to one of those. And I mean, I guess we were actively searching for maybe a couple weeks.
But then we hired a private investigator.
We hired a private investigator to search after that, just to see if they could find any information, any details. I guess a state policeman came here to the house about a year later, a little less than a year after 9/11. I think it was late August of the next year, and said that they had found a small bone from his wrist that was identified with DNA. A request had come in, there was an idea of building a homeless shelter, a permanent homeless shelter here in Frederick, that the Religious Coalition had started, you know, the seeds were out. Once they kind of had that naming gift, the ball just rolled on, and it helped to get the shelter built. We thought it was a good way to honor Alan, and at the same time a good thing for the community, and so it's worked out. Of course, we loved our son. We miss him. We know he's in a better place, even though it hurts our hearts. You know, we grieve for him, and, you know, we miss him here on the earth, but we are absolutely convinced that he's in a better place. And, you know, whether he's looking down on this interview or whatever, I don't know about that, but I know that he's fine, and at some point in the future we'll see him again.